Rome, December the 8th, 1854. A man stood inside St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by the heavy smell of incense, the flickering light of thousands of candles, and the echoing silence of a massive congregation. Outside those ancient stone walls, steam trains were already crisscrossing the European continent. Telegraph wires were actively transmitting messages between major cities. The very first commercial photographs were already being printed and sold in studios in Paris and London. The modern, industrial world had fully arrived. And in the dead center of this technological revolution, Pope Pius IX read a Latin document out loud. He was officially defining a dogma that almost every Christian today assumes is 2,000 years old. When the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza taught us to read religious texts, his central rule was simple but devastating. Stop looking at the eternal claims and start looking at the dates on the paper. Because the date on the Immaculate Conception changes everything we know about it. Before we open these archives and look at the actual documents, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It is incredibly important for the YouTube algorithm to understand that this kind of historical investigation has real value. It is exactly what allows me to keep digging into these forgotten archives and bringing these buried stories to you week after week. I taught theology for 40 years before I retired. Every single December, as the 8th of the month approached, I would see the exact same phenomenon happen in my classrooms. It did not matter if I was talking to a room full of first-year undergraduate students fresh out of secondary school, or a seminar table full of seasoned vicars with gray hair and decades of pastoral experience. If you stop the average person on the street, or even sitting in a church pew on a Sunday morning, and ask them what the Immaculate Conception actually is, 99% of them will confidently tell you the exact same thing. They will tell you it is the story of Jesus Christ being conceived without a human father. They will tell you it is just another name for the virgin birth. It is arguably the most famous theological phrase in Western Christianity. And almost everyone has it completely and utterly backwards. The Immaculate Conception is not about Jesus. It never was. It has absolutely nothing to do with the virgin birth. The virgin birth is the ancient claim found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit. But the Immaculate Conception is entirely about Mary. It is the specific theological doctrine that Mary herself was conceived in the biological womb of her own mother, Saint Anne, without any stain of original sin. It means that while Mary had a human father and a human mother and was conceived through normal human biology, God miraculously intervened at the precise microscopic moment of her conception to preserve her soul from the inherited disease of original sin. That is what the phrase means, but this universal confusion is not an accident. It happens because we are explicitly taught to absorb these doctrines as timeless, invisible truths that just float in the air, descending from heaven fully formed. We are never taught to look at the mechanical, administrative, and highly political history of how they were actually built. I spent 43 years of my life as a practicing Anglican. In the Church of England, we never celebrated the solemnity of the Immaculate Conception. It was not a holy day of obligation on our liturgical calendar. It felt like a foreign country to me, a piece of Catholic architecture that I observed from a distance. But I remember the exact moment the historical reality of this doctrine truly hit me. I was a doctoral student at Durham University. It was late autumn, the air was freezing and damp, and I was shivering inside a dusty, poorly lit second-hand bookshop just down the cobbled street from the great Norman Cathedral. I had gone in there looking for a readable copy of Spinoza's theological political treatise. I found it tucked away on a bottom shelf, wedged between two larger volumes. But right next to it, resting on the same warped wooden plank of discarded theology books, was a fragile 19th century edition of a papal document called Ineffabilis Deus. It was printed in Latin. The pages were yellowed and smelled of old paper and damp stone. I bought them both. And reading those two texts together, sitting at a small desk in my student room with the cold rain hitting the glass, completely broke my understanding of how religious history actually works. Spinoza argued that if you want to understand a sacred text or a religious dogma, you have to look at the political and historical conditions of the human beings who wrote it. In his Tractatus, Spinoza famously pointed out that Moses could not possibly have written the entire Pentateuch because it contains the account of his own death and burial. Spinoza argued that these texts were compiled much later by human editors, specifically Ezra the scribe, living in a specific historical moment. He taught us to trace the ink on the page. You have to find the human fingerprints. You cannot just accept the claim that a text or a doctrine fell from the sky. So, let us apply Spinoza's method and look at the ink of Ineffabilis Deus. When we think of a major Catholic dogma, we instinctively imagine something ancient. We picture bearded patriarchs debating in the 1st century in the deserts of the Middle East, or maybe a massive medieval council in a candlelit room in Trent or Nicaea, with bishops in rich robes arguing over Greek translations. But Ineffabilis Deus was published in 1854. Think about that date for a moment. Charles Darwin was actively writing his theories of evolution. The telegraph was already becoming old news and transforming global communication. The blueprint for the Eiffel Tower was not far off. The world was undeniably modern. It was a world of steam, steel, and industry. And yet this was the exact moment the Catholic Church decided to make the Immaculate Conception a binding, infallible rule of faith for every Catholic on the planet. But here is what the official, sanitized history does not tell you. It was not a sudden, divine revelation that swept through the Vatican. It was a massive, highly coordinated global administrative project that took years to execute. In 1849, 5 years before the final decree was read in Rome, Pope Pius IX did something entirely unprecedented in the history of the papacy. He sent out a survey. He issued a formal encyclical called Ubi Primum. Pius IX was actually living in exile in Gaeta at the time, having been driven out of Rome by a republican revolution. From his miserable exile, he effectively sent a detailed theological questionnaire to every single Catholic bishop on the face of the earth. He asked them what their local clergy, their university theologians, and their everyday congregations thought about making Mary's sinless conception an official, unquestionable dogma. Think about the sheer logistical madness of this in 1849. The letters went out on steamships across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. They traveled on coal-powered trains across Europe. They were carried by horses and carriages into remote, rural dioceses in Asia and Africa. And eventually, month after month, year after year, the physical paper replies came back to Italy, where they were meticulously filed and cataloged by Vatican administrators. Exactly 603 bishops responded to the papal survey. The overwhelming majority of those bishops said yes. They were in favor of the declaration. They reported that their people already believed it and celebrated it. But here is the massive crack in the foundation. Here is what they absolutely do not teach you in Sunday school or confirmation classes. 56 or 57 of those bishops expressed serious documented reservations about making it a dogma. and 4 or 5 of them were completely and unambiguously opposed to defining it as a dogma at all. One of those dissenting men was Marie-Dominique Auguste Ciboure, the Archbishop of Paris. The Archbishop of one of the most intellectually and politically important Catholic cities in the entire world looked at this proposed dogma and officially said no in writing. He argued that the Pope simply did not have the theological authority to invent a new dogma without a full church council. This was not a unified, unbroken tradition peacefully descending from heaven. It was a 19th century consultation process. There were votes. There was intense, bitter debate. There was high-level dissent from major metropolitan leaders. And ultimately, the Pope made the decision entirely alone, overriding the concerns of men like Archbishop Ciboure. When Pius IX proclaimed the dogma in 1854, it was the very first time in the entire history of the Church that a pope had defined a dogma entirely by himself, acting ex cathedra, completely outside the authority of an ecumenical council. It was a massive political test run for papal infallibility, which would not even become official doctrine itself until 16 years later, in 1870. But why did Archbishop Ciboure and the other dissenting bishops resist so strongly? To understand that, we have to go back further into the archives, because the official institutional narrative always insists that the Church has always believed this, in one continuous, unbroken chain of tradition stretching back to the apostles. They claim it is an eternal truth that simply took time to be formalized. That claim is simply not true. And we know it is not true because of a Dominican friar who lived in the 13th century. His name was Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas is not just another theologian. He is not a footnote. He is the single most influential thinker in the history of the Catholic Church. His writings are the absolute, undisputed bedrock of Catholic theology. Even today, centuries later, seminarians are required to study him before they can be ordained. And Thomas Aquinas argued explicitly, logically, and forcefully against the Immaculate Conception. If you open his masterwork, the Summa Theologiae, specifically Part 3, Question 27, you will see the ink on the page. Aquinas was sitting in a cold stone cell in a monastery holding a quill, methodically thinking through the logical consequences of the Christian narrative of salvation. He realized there was a massive, unavoidable mathematical problem. In medieval theology, original sin was not just a metaphorical mark. It was an inherited disease of the soul, passed down through human generation. If Mary was completely and totally exempt from original sin from the very first microscopic moment of her biological existence, then she never needed a savior. She was already perfect. And if she never needed a savior, then Jesus Christ is not the universal redeemer of all humanity, because there would be at least one human being who did not require his redemption. For Aquinas, that was absolute theological heresy. Christ had to save everyone. There could be absolutely no exceptions, not even for his own mother. Therefore, Aquinas concluded, Mary had to have been conceived with original sin like every other human being, and then cleansed of it later in the womb by the grace of God, before she was born. The entire Dominican order, which was one of the most powerful intellectual forces in medieval Europe, adopted Aquinas' position as their official, uncompromising stance. For generations, they preached vehemently against the Immaculate Conception. They fought bitterly over it in the universities, in the streets, and in the pulpits. This was not a fringe, marginalized opinion held by a few rogue scholars in a forgotten corner of the empire. This was the theological heavyweight champion of the world declaring that this doctrine was fundamentally flawed and actively dangerous to the core message of Christianity. So, how did we get from Thomas Aquinas firmly saying no in the 13th century to Pope Pius IX unilaterally saying yes in the 19th century? The answer involves another man sitting in another room with another quill. His name was John Duns Scotus. He was a Franciscan friar, a brilliant, highly technical logician, and the intellectual rival to the Dominicans. In the year 1307, at the University of Paris, which was the absolute intellectual capital of the medieval world, Duns Scotus engaged in a highly public, incredibly high-stakes theological disputation. He stood up in front of the academic masters of Europe, wrapped in his heavy wool habit against the Parisian cold, and mathematically solved Aquinas' problem. He introduced a radical new concept called preventive redemption. Scotus argued that Mary was indeed saved by the merits of Christ, but she was saved in advance. He used a very famous analogy that changed the course of theological history. Imagine a deep, dangerous pit. If you fall into that pit and someone throws down a rope and pulls you out, they have saved you. But if you are walking toward the pit, entirely unaware of the danger, and someone steps in front of you and catches you just before you fall in, they have also saved you. In fact, Scotus argued, they have saved you in a much more perfect and elegant way. Scotus proposed that the redemptive power of Christ reached backward in time to the very moment of Mary's conception, preventing her from ever falling into the pit of original sin in the first place. Therefore, Christ was still her Savior. He just saved her preventively rather than reactively. The Franciscans absolutely loved this elegant logical solution. The Dominicans absolutely hated it. The two religious orders went to intellectual war over this specific piece of theology for centuries. They wrote vicious, highly technical pamphlets against each other. They publicly denounced each other from pulpits across Europe, sometimes causing riots in the streets. The debate became so incredibly toxic and so profoundly unresolved that the papacy eventually had to step in and legally ban both sides from calling the other heretics, simply because the argument was tearing the intellectual fabric of the church apart. In fact, the debate was so explosive that even the Council of Trent, the massive 16th century council that codified almost every other Catholic doctrine in response to the Protestant Reformation, deliberately refused to touch it. The bishops at Trent had the perfect opportunity to make the Immaculate Conception an official dogma, but they looked at the Dominican-Franciscan War, realized it was still far too dangerous and unresolved, and explicitly decided to leave the question entirely open. They completely sidestepped the issue to avoid a civil war within the church. This is the messy, deeply human history that gets completely erased when a dogma is finally declared. The centuries of bitter fighting, the theological gymnastics, the academic rivalries in Paris, the deliberate silence of the Council of Trent, the administrative surveys sent by steamship, the archbishops who voted no in writing. It all gets smoothed over by the institution. It gets packaged into a neat little box with a gold ribbon on it, and it gets handed to the faithful as an eternal, unbroken truth that has always existed exactly as it is today. But Spinoza warned us about exactly this dynamic in his Tractatus. He told us that powerful institutions will always present their final negotiated decisions as the direct, unquestionable voice of God, when in reality, they are always the result of very human arguments, political pressures, and historical accidents. If you read the Catholic Encyclopedia, even their own historical sections admit that while private devotion to Mary's purity existed in the East and West for centuries, and there was a regional feast of the Conception in the 7th and 8th centuries, the actual theological doctrine remained fiercely disputed and was never binding on the whole Church until that winter day in 1854. That is a gap of over 1,000 years between the earliest regional devotional traces and the official dogmatic definition. 1,000 years of absolute silence, followed by centuries of vicious arguments, before it suddenly became an infallible truth that every Catholic had to believe under pain of mortal sin. Now, whenever I present these historical facts, I always get the exact same 3 objections from modern skeptics and apologists. So, let us address them directly, one by one. The first objection I always hear is this: you are being deliberately misleading. Catholics have always believed this, and 1854 was just a formality, putting an old belief into official words. But the historical record shows that this so-called formality was contested for over 1,000 years by the Church's own theologians. As we just saw, Thomas Aquinas, the most authoritative doctor of the Church, argued against it on Christological grounds. A belief that the single most influential Catholic theologian in history explicitly rejected is not a belief that was always universally held. It was a live, unresolved, bleeding dispute that was finally settled by a papal decree in the 19th century, not by divine consensus in the 1st century. The second objection I get is that I am conflating the Immaculate Conception with the virgin birth just to manufacture confusion that does not really exist among educated Catholics. They claim nobody actually makes this mistake, but the confusion is absolutely not manufactured. It is the single most common misunderstanding cited across Catholic catechetical and apologetics literature itself. Dioceses constantly publish explainer articles trying to clarify the difference to their own parishioners. Priests fumble the explanation in the confessional and from the pulpit. It is a documented pastoral problem across the entire English-speaking world. Catholic educators routinely publish these articles precisely because their own people get it wrong. I am reporting a documented institutional problem, not inventing one for a video. And the third objection is always about Lourdes. They say the Lourdes apparition proves the dogma was true independent of church politics, because an uneducated peasant girl could not have possibly made up that complex theological phrase on her own. And this brings us to the final, almost cinematic twist in the history of this dogma. Because it involves a teenage girl, a damp cave, and a timeline that is simply too perfect to ignore. Remember that Pope Pius IX officially published Ineffabilis Deus on December 8, 1854. The exact text of the document declared that Mary, in the first instance of her conception, by a singular privilege and grace granted by God, was preserved exempt from all stain of original sin. For the next 3 years, this brand new dogma was the biggest news in the global Catholic world. It was preached from every single pulpit in France. It was printed in every Catholic newspaper, pamphlet, and parish newsletter. The exact phrase, Immaculate Conception, was deeply saturated into the cultural and religious air of the time. It was impossible to attend Mass in France during those years without hearing about it. Decades earlier, in 1830, another French nun named Catherine Labour had reported a vision that led to the mass production of the miraculous medal, which featured the prayer, "O Mary, conceived without sin." The entire French Catholic ecosystem was already primed and vibrating with this specific theological language. Then, on March the 25th, 1858, exactly 3 years and 3 months after the papal decree in Rome, a 14-year-old peasant girl named Bernadette Suberus was gathering firewood near a shallow, muddy grotto in Lourdes, a small town in southern France. Bernadette was desperately poor. Her family lived in a single, dark room that used to be the town jail. She was unschooled and completely illiterate. But on that day, she reported seeing a vision of a beautiful lady dressed in white. Over the course of several weeks, the visions continued. When Bernadette finally asked the lady for her name, the figure reportedly answered with a very specific, highly technical theological phrase. She did not say, "I am Mary." She did not say, "I am the Mother of God." According to Bernadette, the lady said, "I am the Immaculate Conception." The church investigators were absolutely thrilled. They immediately pointed to this event as divine, undeniable confirmation of the Pope's decree. How could an uneducated, illiterate peasant girl possibly know such a complex, abstract theological term unless it was a genuine miracle? It was the perfect supernatural validation of a highly controversial administrative decision. But Spinoza would ask us to look at the environment. He would ask us to look closely at the timeline. For over 39 consecutive months, the exact phrase Immaculate Conception had been echoing through the parishes, the Sunday homilies, and the devotional literature of the entire French countryside. It was the defining, inescapable theological buzzword of the decade. The timing of the Lourdes apparition arriving just when the new dogma needed supernatural validation is a documented historical fact. You can look at the records from the Medical Bureau of Lourdes. You can trace the timeline yourself. I am not here to tell you what Bernadette actually saw in that cave. I am here to tell you that the theological words she used were already the most heavily promoted institutional branding of her era. This is why all of this matters. It is not just about getting a theological trivia question right. It is not just about finally knowing the difference between the virgin birth and Mary's conception. It is about how we understand the nature of truth itself. If you were raised in a strict religious environment, you were almost certainly taught that truth is a monolith. You were taught that dogmas are ancient, unchanging, and handed down directly from heaven in a pristine state. You were taught that the institution just protects what has always been there. But when you actually take the time to open the archives, when you actually look at the ink on the paper, you find something completely different. You find arguments. You find centuries of fierce disagreement. You find theological wars between monks. You find global surveys sent by train and steamship. You find popes making unilateral executive decisions in the modern industrialized era. The text was not revealed, it was constructed. If this investigation brought you any value today, if it helped you see the human machinery behind the institutional curtain, I want you to strongly consider supporting the channel through the Super Thanks button below. I do not have a university department funding this research anymore. I do not have a wealthy institution backing me. This channel runs entirely, 100% on the support of people like you. People who want to understand the historical reality of these texts, rather than just blindly accepting the institutional narrative. Your direct support is what allows me to buy the rare books, access the restricted archives, and spend the weeks required to put these historical puzzles together. You are not just a passive viewer. You are an active participant in this research, and I want to know exactly what you think. I want you to go down to the comments right now and tell me this. If you grew up in a religious household, did you also think the Immaculate Conception was about Jesus? How old were you when you finally realized it was actually about Mary? Or are you just finding this out right now today from watching this video? Be completely honest in the comments. I read them all, and I know this confusion is everywhere. Also, if you want to dig deeper into exactly how to read these texts historically, I have linked the Spinoza Archive Library in the pinned comment below. It is a comprehensive 5-volume collection that breaks down this exact method of historical investigation. The pinned comment has the full picture. We have spent our entire lives being told not to look at the dates. We are told not to look at the history, just to have faith. But the history is exactly where the truth actually lives. Until next time, keep reading the archives and keep questioning the official story. This is the Spinoza Archive, and I will see you all in the very next investigation.